Hello everyone. In this lesson we will learn about responsive images. We will begin by asking the question, what is a responsive image and why do we need it? Next, we will look at an example page that I set up, and we will see that there are two unique situations when we would want to use a responsive image, and each of these situations calls for different code. And finally, by the end of the lesson, we will apply what we've learned by beginning to add responsive images to our travel website. All right, let's begin up at the top. Number one, what is a responsive image and why do we need it? A responsive image is very similar to a traditional image. So for example, here is a traditional image. So right now we are looking at an example page that I set up for this lesson, and here's what it looks like in the browser. Now this image file is well suited for a desktop monitor or a large laptop. But if we view this same page on a smartphone form factor, I immediately see two big problems. Number one is that we are forcing smartphone users to download way more data than is necessary for them to see a crisp photo of the dog. The smartphone user should not have to download an image that is almost 2,000 pixels wide when an image that is about 500 pixels would do just fine. So currently this is needlessly burning through the smartphone user's data plan. The second big problem is simply the way that the image is cropped, right? So this image is very wide and not very tall. Now this cropping and aspect ratio works wonderfully on a large, wide screen, but on a smaller screen, it just feels kind of scrunched up. I think on smaller screens, the image would look better if it was closer to a square, and if we could crop around the dog's face very tightly. All right, so clearly this page in its current form is not ideal. And the problem is that this traditional image element is forcing us to send one single image file to every user and device under the sun. Instead, what we need is a way to send different image files to different screen sizes. And that is exactly what responsive images do. So right now, we are going to work through two unique examples of converting this traditional image into a responsive image. Now the reason I said two examples instead of just one is because there are two distinct reasons to use a responsive image in the first place. And depending on which reason or situation you're dealing with, you need to write different code. Alright, so the first situation when you would use a responsive image, let's call it the art direction and cropping situation. And let's call the second situation the image resolution and file size situation. So in our first example, we will look at the art direction and cropping situation. So I've prepared these three images, small, medium, and large. And in our second example, we will look at the image resolution and file size situation. So for that example, I've prepared these three images, small, medium, and large. Now in this example, these three images are identical. They are the exact same photograph. They are cropped exactly the same. The only difference is their size. All right, so let's work through both examples. Let's begin with the first one, the art direction and cropping situation. Let's get started by jumping into our text editor. And I'm going to delete this traditional image so we can start with a clean slate. So when you want to send different images to different users because of art direction or cropping reasons, you use the picture element. Now within the picture element, we want to begin with a traditional image element, right? So image, source, and we want to begin with the smallest image. So for this example page, I have an images folder, and let's grab the smallest image. So its name is dog crop small. Let's be sure to provide an alt value, say puppy in the sand, and close out this image element. So if we save this and refresh the browser, no surprises here. So that image will be used for all devices. But here is where things get interesting. Within this picture element, we can create another element named source. And within this source element, we can create a media query. So let's create a media query that targets any screens that are 760 pixels or larger. So we can just say minimum width, min width, 760 pixels. And what do we want to do for screens that are this size or larger? We no longer want to use the small image of the dog. Instead, when a screen is this size or larger, we want to use the medium-sized image of the dog. So within the source element, we can just use a new attribute named source set and point towards the medium image. So images, dog, crop, medium.jpg. So if we save this file and refresh in the browser, if I start to expand this window, as soon as it reaches a width of 760 pixels, it switches from the small image to the medium image. Let's go ahead and set up our large image. To do that, we can just create another source element. So let's create a media query that selects any screens that are at least 1200 pixels or larger. So if a screen meets this condition, we want to use the large image. So source set, and then we just point towards the large image. Dog crop large.jpg. So if we save and refresh, as I start to make this window larger, once it hits 1200 pixels, it begins to use the large image. So let's see all three sizes back to back really quickly. So here's large, here's medium, and here's small. So that brings example 1 to a close. This is how you create a responsive image when you need to have fine-grained control over how your images are being cropped at different screen sizes. All right, so when you need to use a responsive image for art direction reasons, you use the picture element. Now let's move on to example number 2. Let's delete this code. So we've covered the art direction and cropping situation. Now let's talk about the image resolution and file size situation. So in this example, we are dealing with these three images: small, medium, and large. In this example, we love the way that the image is cropped. We want it to be cropped like this for every screen size. However, even though that's the case, there's still no reason to make a smartphone user download this large image that is intended for desktop monitors. That would be a waste of their data plan, and it would make the page load slower than if they could download the small image instead. In this case, we do not need to use the picture element. Instead, we can begin with a traditional image element, and all we need to do is create a smorgasbord of image file options for the web browser and device to choose from. So we use the source set attribute, and within this one attribute, we are going to list all of our images. So let's start with the small image, dog resolution small.jpg. Then we just add a comma and list out our medium-sized image, comma. Let's include the large image, images dog resolution large.jpg. So in this situation, we are taking a very hands-off approach. We don't need to write a media query. We don't have any opinion whatsoever about when the browser or device should use each one of these images. The browser and the device can figure that out on their own, right? Because devices are self-aware. They know the size of their own screen, and they also know the pixel density of their screen. So browsers and devices are intelligent enough to choose the smallest image file that will still result in a crisp picture. However, as a developer, we do need to help the web browser out a little bit, because web browsers can figure out the size of an image, but not until it's downloaded it. And we don't want the web browser to have to download all three images. That would defeat the entire purpose of this responsive image. So what we need to do is tell the browser the size of each image so it knows which one to use. So for example, after we list the small image, before the comma, we just include a space, and then we say 570W. This is our way of saying, hey web browser, this image is 570 pixels wide. All right, and then we just want to do that for the medium image as well. So after the file name, include a space, and this image is 1200 pixels wide. And after the large image file name, include a space, and this image is 1920 pixels wide. Now before we save this and test it out in the browser, let's add a quick alt value, puppy in the sand. Let's save the file and refresh in the browser. So my web browser, Google Chrome, looked at the pixel density of my monitor and the current size of my browser window, and it determined that the small image was large enough to result in a crisp picture. Now if I start to make this window larger, as soon as the small image would be too small and it would begin to pixelate or blur, Google Chrome knows to switch to the medium image. And obviously, if we make the window even larger, at some point it will need to switch to the large image in order to stay crisp. Now, different devices and different browsers have different ways of determining when they should use which image. So I want to point out and remind you that this is a very hands-off approach. We are not trying to micromanage when the browser should use which image. We provide a smorgasbord of options. We take our hands off the keyboard and say this is out of our control. It is up to the device to make the smartest image choice. Now, really quickly, before we move on, I want to show you an example of why you shouldn't stress over which image the device is choosing. So for example, in Google Chrome, if I refresh the page while the browser window is relatively large, and I start to shrink the screen, you'll notice that it never uses the medium-sized image, and even at the smallest size that I can drag to, it's not using the small image. This is because Chrome is intelligent enough to know that if an image was sharp enough for a large window, it's obviously sharp enough for a small window, and there's no sense in burning through extra data to download those smaller images. Now, that is a great feature, but it can be a bit frustrating when you're testing things out and developing on your computer. So you might ask yourself, how can I make sure that my small image is set up correctly? You can do a few things. You can clear your browser's cache and not visit this page until you've already made the browser window small. Or you can open up a new incognito window and visit the page. And the large image will no longer be in the browser's cache, so it will download the smartest image choice for this window size, which is obviously the small image. Alright, so at this point we've worked through the two examples. We now know the two different reasons to create a responsive image. The first was centered around art direction and how we crop the images at different screen sizes. And the second situation was more concerned with image resolution, file size, and making sure that the page loads quickly. Now we are ready to move on to the final part of this lesson and apply what we've learned. So let's work together to add responsive images to our travel agency website. Let's get started. If you need to pause this lesson for just a moment to get things set up, that's a-okay. But to get things rolling, in the command line, just use npm run dev. And then in your browser, you can visit localhost:3000. So let's give ourselves the task of making the image in this large hero block responsive. Currently, if we make our browser window smaller, we see that the way this image is cropped is problematic for smaller screen sizes. We know exactly how to fix this, so let's get to work. Go ahead and open up the travel site project folder in your favorite text editor, and within the app folder, open up the index.html file. So let's look for that large hero section. Here it is, and here is the image element that we want to replace. Before we delete this line of code though, we see that the image file we are currently pointing towards is named hero large. And if we look within the image folder for the project, so travel site, app, assets, images, we see that here is that hero large file. And you will notice that there is another file named hero medium, hero small, and even hero smaller. And all of these images are cropped differently. So let's go ahead and delete this traditional image element and replace it with the picture element that we learned about earlier. So within the picture element, we want to create a traditional image element, and we always want to begin with the smallest image first. So image source, and the name of the smallest image is hero -- smaller. So we want to go into the assets folder and then the images folder. And the name of the file is hero -- smaller.jpg. And while we are here, let's be sure to include an alt value. Let's say coastal view of ocean and mountains. So if we save this and check our browser, we see that that looks a lot better. This image is cropped in a way so that it is tall enough and creates enough space for our content for the section. All right, and for screens that are slightly larger, instead of using hero -- smaller, we want to use hero -- small. So within this picture element, we just create a new source element, and let's set up a media query. Let's say that if a screen is at least 640 pixels or larger, stop using the smaller image and begin using source set, the next largest image, which is in the assets folder and the images folder, and its name is hero-small. So if we save this and make our browser window just a tiny bit wider, we see that it hits the breakpoint and swaps to the new image. So now we want to do the same thing for the medium and large image. So let's actually just copy and paste this line of code, and let's duplicate it a few times. So this line of code is good to go. Let's edit this line of code. So instead of small, let's change this to medium, and let's change the media query to use a min width of 990 pixels. And for this top source line, let's change this to large, and let's change its media query to 1380 pixels. So let's save this and check out the browser. If we start making the window larger, this is now using the medium image. And if we go even larger, this is now using the large image. Now you might think that our job here is done. We encountered an art direction and cropping situation, and we created a responsive image. But what if I told you we can also combine the image resolution and file size situation into this responsive image? So for example, when my browser window is quite large like this image file is 1920 pixels wide. Now that looks great on my monitor because the monitor I'm using right now does not have a very high pixel density. But what if I was using a 4K monitor or even a 5K monitor? In that case, we would want to send an even larger image that is using this exact same cropping ratio. And if you look in the project's image folder, you will notice that that larger, higher resolution copy of each image already exists. So for example, here is hero-large, and here we see hero-large high DPI. So these two files use the exact same cropping ratio, but this one is double the size. So within our code, within the source element for the large image, within the source set attribute, we can simply provide another image. So we add a comma and a space, and then we say assets images, hero-large-high-dpi.jpg. And then remember, we want to tell the browser the size of each of these images so it knows which one to use. So for this first file, it has a width of 1920 pixels, and the high DPI version is double that. So it has a width of 3840 pixels. Let's go ahead and add in the high DPI versions for the medium, small, and smaller crops. So that way, if someone's laptop or tablet or smartphone is using a Retina display or something similar, they will have an image large enough to result in a crisp picture. So on this medium line, let's add in a second image, assets images hero-medium high DPI. And then we want to add in the width values for both of these images. So the baseline medium file is 1380 pixels wide, and the high DPI version is double that, 2760 pixels wide. Let's do the same thing for this small version. So we add a comma, assets images hero-small high DPI. The baseline version of this image is 990 pixels wide. The high DPI version is 1980 pixels wide. And finally, for the smallest crop, we want to change this attribute from source to source set, and then we just want to add in the second image. So comma, assets images hero-smaller high DPI. So the baseline copy of this image is 640 pixels wide, and the high DPI version is 1280. So let's save this file and check things out in the browser. So now we have a responsive image that sends different crops to different screen sizes, and at each unique crop, it can send a high DPI version if necessary. That will bring this lesson to a close, and in our next lesson, I will show you a few quick tips to help you test and experiment with your responsive images. I will see you in the next lesson.